so we'll make sure that they have enough time. So I thought I'd start out maybe on a little lighthearted nature, since we're all just getting back from a 3-day weekend. So I wanted to talk a little bit about vacation planning. And successful vacations usually start with doing some planning at home. Making a packing list and making sure you have the right size luggage to put all that stuff in. That allows you to be organized. It allows you to have a lot of confidence that you're not leaving something that you really need when you're going to get there. It also allows you to be maybe prepared for a contingency, like bringing along some aspirin or some Pepto-Bismol if you're going to Mexico or something like that. And it also makes you think about it ahead of time and not bring things that are too heavy or things that you really aren't going to need. Also, usually when we plan vacations, most of us are looking at it from a budget standpoint, making a trade of how long we can spend somewhere, what method of transportation we're going to take. You also trade against how much time you have to spend in that location, and you think about how comfortable do I want to be or do I need to be? Am I going to go to a luxurious hotel or am I going to go camping? That affects what you bring. It affects what you plan for. It affects how you look at the trip in advance. Oh, I'm going hiking, so I have to study all of these maps before I go, so I at least will keep myself out of trouble, or I at least have to look at where the bears are going to be so I don't get eaten by a bear if I go hiking Yosemite. And that also speaks to the risk that you're willing to take. Are you bringing along your whole family, or are you just going to go sit on a beach, and so you have to make sure you have all the essentials there, or are you going by yourself and you're going to be hiking up Mount Everest? So, why am I talking about vacation planning? Well, again, it is just a lighthearted way to start, but this integrated medical model tool that this team has built, they're under their 4th year of building this model, and it's part of the advanced medical capabilities in the human research program. And it really is an integrated model. We sat down and talked with Doug Butler, the team lead, about this for a little bit a couple of weeks ago, and barely scratched the surface on everything that the tool can do or could do if it was allowed to. But it's an integrated look that tries to tie together really what you're going to need when you get where you're going, based on your mission scenario, based on what the acceptable level of risk is. So that drives what supplies you have to bring, what the vehicle needs to do, what the people need to know how to do, so how long you have to train in advance and what you have to train on, so forth and so on. It's a very integrated model, and it is risk-based. And so you've probably seen any of you who've come to the Knowledge broadcast before might have seen this picture. We're still coming up with our definitions of what all of these domains mean, but basically with this, medical model, it really is attempting to connect the dots and look at the bigger picture to make sure that what the human needs to be able to perform well and to stay healthy and integrated with the vehicle, that they are covered. And that's what this tool is attempting to do as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Doug's team. I'm not going to do a brief introduction of each team member, but it is a great team, and just talking to Doug very briefly, it sounds like it's a very good example of what you can accomplish when you get the right people working in a right focused environment. So hope you enjoy the presentation.
Great, thank you, Debbie. What you're about to see is a 4-part presentation where I'll lead off with an overview of the project and the tool and risk in general, and then Dr. Eric Kurzman will lead into the clinical aspects. Lynn Sale is our nurse and clinical coordinator, but her voice is a little hurting today, so I believe Eric is going to cover that section. And then our lead modeler, Dr. Charlie Menard, will finish up with a case example of the real model output, and then I'll wrap up and we'll have an open discussion after that. So what are the project goals? When we started this 4 years ago, the primary, it was a twofold goal, and that was to develop the tool that was integrated and stochastic and probabilistic and evidence-based, and something that we could use to forecast risk and optimize healthcare systems. And that was great, but unless it gets incorporated into the organization and used in the context of aligning the organizational activities and helping decisions, it wasn't going to do any good. So we've got two goals: one, to build the tool, and the other is to implement it within the decision-making processes of the organization. The scope and approach of the integrated medical model is the scope is we're really looking at in-flight healthcare risks only. We don't look at chronic post-flight risks. That could be another modeling effort on its own right. Our approach that we used was to start with the International Space Station data and use that as a stepping stone for the Constellation program, and use PRA techniques, orthodox PRA techniques, use evidence-based approach on what we knew and what we didn't know, and collaborate with other NASA centers, and in particular Dr. Jerry Myers at Glenn Research Center, and leverage that modeling capability that exists out there. So what is IMM? Well, it's a software-based decision support tool, and it's primarily, in the end, it's going to help us design that piece of luggage that Debbie described that you're going to take on your vacation. And in our case, it's the mission. So, as most of us know, we're constrained severely on mass and volume, and what the tool actually allows you to do is optimize the allocation of that mass and volume constraint. So for a given level of risk and crew performance, we can start making those trades. The software technology that we've used to date is to do the proof of concept prototype. We used a software called Crystal Ball, and that's widely used. And it was great to prove the concept, but it very quickly became, well, after about 2.5 years, it became pretty unwieldy. And so we're in the process of migrating to a more capable platform, SaaS, which is also widely used in industry, and that'll give us a lot more capability. So the Constellation program's young, and IMM is coming online, and it's going to, some of the key benefits that you're going to get out of IMM is the ability to capture knowledge across the organization and use that in your decision-making process. And because we had to quantify it and provide the evidence behind it, it provides an objective place to go drill down into any specific issue. And when it's used appropriately, it can be objective. You can use it to prioritize, optimize, and communicate across the different disciplines of science, medicine, engineering, operations, training, in terms of risk. Risk tends to be kind of a challenge sometimes when you're talking about likelihood, mitigations, controls, outcomes. So it gives a platform for a common language. So you might ask, well, when is IMM useful? And the nice thing is that IMM is useful at all stages of the program. So at the systems requirements stage, you can start asking yourself questions of, well, what should we have this requirement? Should we not? What's the rationale behind this requirement? IMM can be used to help formulate what the requirements for that spacecraft or that mission is. During the PDR and CDR stages, the IMM can be very useful in asking those what-if questions. Well, what if we fly this? What if we don't fly that? What if we have a crew of 3? What if we have a crew of 6? So it allows you to optimize and prioritize and run sensitivity analyses so you can understand what is driving risk, what is driving successful mission outcomes. During the operational stage of the program, it gets even better because now you have real information coming back down to earth and down into the databases, down into the model. And so now we're able to even forecast even more accurate forecasts in terms of health risks, but also tighten up our uncertainty bands and all that as more and more information gets incorporated in the proper databases. So who benefits? There's, when we look across the different stages of the program, it benefits the risk managers, the requirement managers, the trainers to understand what's most likely to happen. They've only got 70 hours or less to train the crew. Vehicle designers, now we have rationale maybe behind the mass and volume that's allocated to the crew. So it touches different disciplines at different stages in the program, and we can support that along the way. Some common risk vocabulary, we intermix this a lot, and so I just wanted, in terms of IMM, I wanted to kind of connect the dots a little bit. For hazard or threat or initiating event, in terms of IMM, we're talking about the medical event that happens to the crew in flight. For likelihood, when we talk about likelihood, we're talking about the probability of a medical event happening in flight to the crew. Consequence, outcome, end state, we're talking about evacuation, loss of crew life. Those are specific end states that we're talking about. The crew health index is something unique to IMM that we've developed based on the quality adjusted life years that's used out in the epidemiological domain. I sometimes refer to this as the crew happy index because the higher that number is, the happier they are and the more capable they're able to perform their duties. So we want to see a high crew health index. Control and mitigation for the purposes of IMM. Controls and mitigations are the in-flight medical systems. That's what we're trying to optimize. And you might say, well, there's controls and mitigations pre-flight too. Well, that's reflected in the likelihood, and we might get into that in the clinical discussion. So, a common model that we're used to seeing is the 5x5 metrics for a specific health risk of some sort, where you have likelihood on one axis and outcomes on the other, and risk gets moved within this matrix depending on what mitigation you have in place. So you might have one mitigation that drives down just likelihood. That might be crew screening. You might have mitigation B, that might be something you fly on board, and that pushes the outcome down the line. You might have a mitigation one mitigation that affects both the likelihood and outcome. So that's just offered as an example. But when you compare the two, what you'll end up seeing is that the 5x5 matrix is for one specific risk, and the integrated medical model looks at all the medical conditions at the same time in the context of the crew and the mission, within the mission constraints. So what you have with the 5x5 is a qualitative, somewhat subjective, categorical way of looking at one risk. The IMM looks at what are all the medical conditions that you're looking at? What's the probability of that happening? And if you don't have that information, you can bound that likelihood by a distribution or in a probability profile. We're able to say, well, is there one crew, or is there 3 crew, or there's 6 crew? We can do that. The mission profile constraints, we can plug in how much mass and volume you're able to deal with, and then all this loads up the model to get the forecasts of interest that you need to design a medical system. And so if we blow this up for a second, this is all the information that we need to capture prior to even running the model. So there's a lot of value in the inputs that are gained just from knowing what are the threats out there, what's the likelihood of it happening. Then when we get to the forecast, when we run the model in a Monte Carlo simulation, and we have the items of interest, now we can run sensitivity analyses and optimization techniques for a given level of risk. We're able to bound it in terms of mass and volume and power and potentially crew training time. So this gives you a framework for what the integrated medical model does. So once you get that down, then you go, okay, well, what's happening in this box? It's a common question. So what's the black box? And we're still running a Monte Carlo simulation, and so we've loaded up the model with a lot of inputs, and I think the last count the variables were 8,000 plus variables that we're loading up. And we run the model 5,000 to 25,000 times to get a distribution of the outcomes. But what's happening in there for each trial that makes up a simulation, the model's asking, it's like, what happened, how many times, were the essential resources available? If the resources were available, and we're talking about down to the pill level, that's at the unit level that we're capturing the mitigation for treatment and diagnosis. But let's say medical condition happens, was it available? If yes, then we go down one of 2 paths. We go down a best case scenario and a worst case scenario to arrive at our end states of evacuation, loss of crew life, crew health index. And this helps bound the uncertainty in the human system. So even though you might be treated, you still might not respond very well. So this helps bound that uncertainty. Similarly, when the essential resources are not available and you go down the untreated path, we still decrement the resources, whatever were available, so we know they're not there for the next time it happens. And we go down this untreated path where, again, we try to bound, even though it went untreated, the human system, there's uncertainty there. And even though it went untreated, you still might go down one path versus another. So that's how we account for uncertainty. Key development steps, I just want to throw this up, that here's a critical path, and without any one of these steps, the model wasn't going to come together. And now that we've developed the model, we're in a verification and validation and refinement stage, and that's going to last for quite a while. The current development state, right now, we've got the proof of concept prototype that was developed. It was completed September of 08. We have the ability to model 1 to 6 crew members. We represent right now 83 medical conditions. 47 of the medical conditions have occurred in flight, and all the medical resources in type, quantity, mass, down to the unit level associated with each medical condition. So you've seen some of the capabilities that I described earlier. But two of the key capabilities that IMM allows you to do at this point is to run sensitivity analyses to understand what's really driving risk. And once you understand that, you can focus your limited resources on those key attributes. And that's some of the more powerful capabilities that IMM can provide. Some usage history. We've supported the space station program and the constellation program with some of the input information that we've developed for IMM. And we anticipate updating the ISS risk models with some of our output as well. And that's still in work. In closing, I just wanted to say that the IMM is also responsive to the Return to Flight Task Force that was formed after the Columbia accident, where it was observed that analytical models are needed and should be used to appropriately inform decisions because of the nature that they can capture the uncertainty associated with the human system and the likelihood of medical events. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Eric Kurtzman.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, so now you've heard about the overview of IMM, and now I'd like to get into some more details, specifically about the clinical inputs, and then Charles will get into the outputs. So these are the topics I'll cover. I wanted to talk about the medical condition list, how it was developed, how we came up with incidence determinations, functional impairments, which give you the output of the crew health index, and a tool that we developed within the IMM team called the clinical findings form, which helps us keep track of the clinical inputs and provide it to the model. So to begin with, we had to come up with a medical condition list. We needed to know what medical conditions could occur during typical spaceflight missions. And we wanted to have definition for what's a relevant condition. We can't put every possible medical condition in the model, so we want to have the ones that are most relevant. And those would be conditions that have either occurred in flight or we felt had potential to occur in flight. And also that they would either require mitigation or they would result in some functional impairment. So the current status is we have 83 medical conditions in the model, and as Doug mentioned, 47 of these have occurred in flight. So where do we get the medical conditions from? We went through 4 phases. The first phase was we started with the ISS medical checklist. Since we were baseline to the ISS, we thought this was a reasonable place to start. Many of these conditions have occurred in flight. The ones that have not occurred, some people in the program thought they were possible to occur. That's why they were on the checklist. So that was our starting point, and we came up with 70 medical conditions from there. For comprehensiveness, we looked at the shuttle checklist, which is very similar. So we only had one condition that we had to add, and that got us to 71. We then went through LSAH, longitudinal study of astronaut health in-flight occurrences, to see what had been captured within the program that has occurred in flight that had not been captured in the medical checklist. And it turned out to be only 6. So the medical checklists appear to be pretty good in capturing what has happened. And there was a flight surgeon Delphi study going on about a year ago, about 2 or 3 steps to that. And we took the outputs from that, which was basically a consensus group of subject matter experts from flight surgeons who had worked missions and what their concerns were for medical conditions, either that they had seen occur on their missions or they had concern could occur. And that gave us about another 6 conditions into the model. And there are others we can add from the Delphi study as we go forward. So we'll talk a little bit more about the LSAH, because this is where we get a lot of our data from. We looked at these missions, Apollo, Skylab, Mir, Shuttle, and ISS. We went from the beginning of Shuttle through 2005, STS-114, and we went through ISS through Expedition 15. So there's a little bit of a lag, we're a little bit behind, and we don't capture the most recent data, but this may be to our benefit as we validate, because we could potentially validate against the model against missions that haven't occurred and see how well we're predicting. So we're comfortable with that, and we can then add that data in later after we're validated. Turns out there were 47 relevant medical conditions that were captured from LSH, of specific medical events that had occurred in flight that we wanted to put in the model. After we have the medical conditions, we have to put in some probability for likelihood. We have to figure out what is the likelihood of an event occurring for the model to work. And we really need to quantify this. So we need to put an actual value on this for the model. And we define incidents as the number of new medical events that occur within a specified period of time. But to make the model work, we had to come up with two types of incidents: an incidence proportion, also known as a cumulative incidence, and that's the proportion of a population that developed a medical condition over a certain period of time, the time being our mission. And that is expressed in events per person. And the second type of incidence was an incident rate or an incident density. This is the number of new medical events that occur within a population divided by the time the population is at risk. And this gives you a different unit, events per person unit. And this incidence rate accounts for the different times that each individual is at risk. And we can get both of these types of data from LSAH. And the reason we needed these two type of incidence or incidence rates was because we have really two different types of conditions that can occur in spaceflight, at least from the model's perspective. One is space adaptation syndrome type conditions that most of you are familiar with that happen early on in flight, typically like space motion sickness and back pain and headaches, and non-space adaptation conditions, which are usually related to the time that you're in flight. Things like developing possibly an infection or a sprain or other musculoskeletal type injuries. So currently the model has 9 space adaptation conditions. And the reason I call these out is because they're treated a little differently than all the other conditions, which are the non-space adaptation conditions, and primarily in terms of their incidence. So for the space adaptation conditions, the likelihood of occurrence is not related to the duration of the mission. So whether you're going on a 2-week shuttle mission or a 6-month ISS mission, the probability of you developing space adaptation back pain or space motion sickness is the same, at least the way we do it in the model. And there might be some simplification to that, but it seems to work. And so for that, one other criteria is the condition cannot recur. So you can't get 2 or 3 cases of space motion sickness or 3 cases of space adaptation back pain. We consider it as one event, even if there's a little bit of gap in between. And therefore, we put them in incidence proportion, events per person. And just to give you an example, like nasal congestion is one of our space adaptation conditions. From LSAH data that we had available, there were 405 events among 660 crew, so it's a 0.614 events per person. Or another way, you have about a 60% chance of developing nasal congestion on any space flight mission. Now, the non-space adaptation medical conditions, we felt that the likelihood of occurrence was related to the duration of the mission, and the condition may recur, so you may get it more than once. So you may get a urinary tract infection, you could get it in the middle of the flight, you could get another one at the end of the flight. Or a skin rash, you may get it more than one. And so, for example, we looked at LSH data for skin rashes. There were 90 documented skin rashes. Total denominator was 27.34 person years of space flight time. So our rate is 3.29 events per person year. So that's in the model. And as you probably see, a lot of this input data is very useful also to the program. And we've had a lot of requests for this type of data. There is uncertainty around this, and we capture that uncertainty in probability distributions because there's uncertainty in capturing those 90 events. We don't know if they've been diagnosed properly. We don't know if we've missed a few or we've overcounted. So we try to capture that uncertainty in probability distributions based on the numbers we have. So we had to really come up with incidence rates for every condition. And for the conditions that occurred in flight, it's relatively easy if they've occurred frequently enough. We use the data I just showed you. But what about conditions that haven't occurred in flight? So someone sustaining a fracture, a bone fracture, or someone developing altitude sickness, or appendicitis, or even kidney stones, which may have happened once in a cosmonaut, but we're not sure. We have to use other methods. So we've gone to external models that we've had developed, for example, from Glenn Research Center has developed fractional model we've used to put in. Engineering data, what's the likelihood of altitude sickness? I think this will be an interesting one for constellation when we have a different environment. Appendicitis, we've used terrestrial population right now. We can use analog populations, maybe military populations that are similarly astronaut poor. And for kidney stones right now in the model, we've used a Bayesian statistical update based on general population, basically updated with our own astronaut poor of how many times we've seen kidney stones, not in flight, but terrestrially. And we have uncertainty captured in that. Well, the next piece of the puzzle is we need to do the outcome. So if a medical event occurs, how severe is the outcome? What's the impact in terms of impairment or loss of crew life or potential evacuation? So for functional impairments, we use the concept of impairments to quantify the severity of the outcome. And we use this definition of impairment. So it could be either anatomical or functional loss. Of course, we're mostly talking about functional loss here. In other words, impairment and function of the astronaut for critical tasks. And it could be either an illness or an injury. So medical illness or injuries we've talked about, like musculoskeletal injuries or environmental injuries. And we've used the AMA, or the American Medical Association Guides to Evaluation of Permanent Impairment, which is a standardized impairment guide in order to have some consistency. And just to give an example of how that works is if you have no impairment from the condition, it's 0%. And if you had completely dependent or approaching death, it would be 100%. And you can be anywhere in between. And some of the examples of that we use for skin infection, for example, we have between 10 and 24% impairment within the model, depending on best case, worst case, and treatments. And shoulder dislocation varies between 36 to 74%. So there's uncertainty captured within these impairments as well. And then we have to get all this input data into the model, to the modeler. So we came up with a clinical findings form, which is really just a document that captures all this data. So we have the incidence proportion or incidence rate for each condition. We have the outcomes in terms of the best case or worst case in an untreated case, as Doug had explained how the model works. We specify the functional impairment and how long the functional impairment exists. So we multiply those together. So if you have 50% impairment for 2 days, they get multiplied. And we have two potential end states, either evacuation or loss of crew life. The CLIF also will specify, or does specify, the level of evidence that we've been able to apply to where we get the data from, and references where we get this data, so we can go forward and verify and validate this and improve it. So in summary, for these clinical inputs, we've developed a list of relevant medical conditions. We've established incidence data for all these conditions. We've assigned crew functional impairments and end states to capture the impact of these medical events, and we've developed a standardized tool to provide these clinical inputs into the model. I'll move on to another set of clinical inputs. Really, our other set of clinical inputs that's really key to IMM is, and I think this is really a key component, is the resources, because this makes all the difference in designing your medical systems. And so what we have are resource tables, and these define the in-flight medical resources available to treat or to diagnose and treat the conditions that occur. And it considers the best and worst case scenario. So we have a resource table for each best case condition and one for each worst case condition. And this gets back to our risk matrix. So this is your in-flight mitigation, a way of you pushing down that risk by minimizing the outcome of that condition occurring. If the condition's already occurred, you can't do anything about that. Now what can you do to mitigate it with in-flight resources? That's what we're looking at. So this is an example of one of our, a set of resource tables for best case and worst case musculoskeletal disorder, or sprain or strain of an extremity. And you can see there's a big difference between what you would need to use to treat this condition, depending if it's a best case scenario or worst case scenario. And these are the things we specify. Is the resource consumable or not? How many do you need? What's the mass and the volume? And currently, we have a commercial off-the-shelf cost of that item. And then we have placeholders for future parameters, such as the power you need to run that device, what would be the cost to flight certify, which would be very different than a commercial off-the-shelf cost, and then sustaining engineering for some items. So we can capture a lot, and also you can look at the detail that we capture this down to a level of, even to a level of a single pill, and so it's a unit assessment, so we don't have to worry about packing factor right now. We can put that in later. So it's just an example. So we have two of these resource tables for each condition. There's 83 conditions, so that's why we can see we have a lot of variables in the model. So these are some assumptions we have in developing the resource tables. The resource table currently in the model reflects the current ISS medical system. So we look at the current ISS medical kit, we look what's available, and we look what you would need to treat the conditions that are in the model. If a condition needs an item that we consider an essential item, like a pharmaceutical that you need to treat a condition, or a certain diagnostic piece of equipment. So if you need the ultrasound device to make that diagnosis and it's not available, or you need an antibiotic to treat that infection, it's not available, those are essential items. If it's not available, the condition will go untreated. Or if the item may not be available because it wasn't flown, or maybe you used them all up because your other conditions used that item already, and that's part of the integrated part. So we're taking into account all the conditions that occur within each trial of the mission. Right now we only use, like I said, commercial off-the-shelf cost, and we do account for spaceflight resources, in fact, that we know they have to be there, and we have those placeholders, but right now we assume that there's essentially unlimited resources. So we have as much oxygen as you would need, or the ability to bandwidth to communicate with the flight surgeons on the ground, or whatever else you need to treat would be unlimited, but we can put that in the model in the future if that becomes limited, just as we do with the other resources. So in summary, for the for the resource tables, this is what we're looking at. We've been able to define the medical resources that you would need to treat, diagnose, and treat the conditions, which basically let you optimize the mission based on the mission profile and the crew profile. And it essentially will let you hopefully mitigate your risk by improving medical outcomes by having the correct resources available depending on your mission and crew profile. I'll pass it on to Charlie to talk about specific outputs.
So I'd like to just present some of the basic thought process, some of the basic outcomes that IMM has to offer right now. And there are many more questions that we can ask of IMM, but I just kind of like to give you a little bit of a taste of what IMM can do. But first, I just want to emphasize the fact that all models are subject to certain assumptions and limitations. These assumptions and limitations may be based on theory. For some theoretical reasons, we have to make certain assumptions. But they may also be based on the data that we have available, or the software that we have available, or any number of possible sources of limitations that we have to make in order to produce these kinds of models. And IMM is no exception. What we'd like to do is produce a model that is useful, something that can be used by certain parties to plan for their respective missions, to plan the resources that they need available, to plan where the research needs to go. So that's the goal of IMM, is to produce a useful product. IMM uses the Monte Carlo methodologies, and this is a Microsoft Excel-based product. As stated earlier, we're currently in the process of switching to a different platform, but everything that I'm going to present here is based on the crystal ball output. And we use a wide variety of probability distributions. So the Monte Carlo simulations, we're not going to choose fixed discrete values to perform our calculations. We're going to assign distributions of values to our parameters, and we're going to randomly select data points from these distributions in order to perform our calculations. We use a wide variety of distributions, and one of our primary outcomes of interest is the crew health index, which I'll talk about here in just a little bit. But I just want to emphasize the fact that IMM developed the CHI as what we thought would be a very good measure of crew health outcome. But we can develop other outcomes of interest. We have mentioned the probability of evacuation or loss of crew life, but it's open, it's flexible. We can develop the outcomes as an on-needed basis. As researchers come in with questions, we can modify the model. We can modify the inputs, the outputs to meet the constraints that the researchers are interested in. The quality adjusted mission time, our CHI. Well, this is based on the quality adjusted life years calculation that is very common in epidemiological research. It's a very standard metric, and it's very nice because it's a weighted measure of health outcomes. And just to give a brief example, we might consider a 35-year-old individual who is expected to live to be 75. So this person is expected to live for an additional 40 years. And suppose this individual at the age of 35 has a medical event that results in 30% functional impairment. Now, in our model, we're going to randomly select this 30%. We're going to randomly select this from some kind of distribution. But just for the sake of this example, this might be something like a below knee amputation. So this individual has 40 life years left, 30% functional impairment. We can calculate the quality adjusted life years by taking the number of life years left, 40, and subtracting off 30% of that number, 30% of 40, and so the individual would have about 28 quality adjusted life years remaining. And we're going to put this in terms of a percent by dividing that 28 by the number of quality adjusted life years that they would have had they not been succumbed to this medical event. So they would have been expected to have 40 quality years, so 28 out of 40 is about 70%. And this is what we're going to call our crew health index. But with respect to IMM, our life is mission time. We're only concerned with the in-flight time period. So the crew health index is a range. It ranges from 0 to 100%. 0%, the crew member would be completely impaired for the duration of the mission, and they would not be able to perform any of their duties. 100%, they would not be impaired at all due to medical conditions, and they would be available to do all of their functions and duties and so forth.
Do you take into account any degradation in the ability of the rest of the crew to perform tasks if they are focused on keeping this other guy healthy? So you could get a negative number?
So if one crew member has to treat a second crew member,
right?
That has been brought up, and we have the ability to add that time in, although the model does not currently have that in it right now. There are some other assumptions. We've approached it from a very conservative viewpoint, but you're right. That is one issue that we thought of. We have not addressed it right now. There are many assumptions and limitations that we're not going to get into right now, but I just want to present a few of the big ones for purposes of the data that I'm going to show you here. First of all, we're assuming that there's 83 medical conditions, and we don't have a list to show you, but our entire universe consists of only these 83 conditions. Outside of these 83 conditions, we're not concerned about anything else right now. We assume that the ISS medical kit is available. Whatever's in that medical kit, that's what we've really baselined our model to right now. And we have a very conservative estimate of the crew health index. And this is really a limitation of the software package and a simplifying assumption for our calculations, where we calculate the crew health index assuming that the medical events occurred on day one of the mission, which of course is not realistic in any stretch of the imagination. But for the purposes of getting a conservative estimate, and based on the limitations that, of the software that we had at the time, this is an assumption that we made in order to calculate the crew health index. But bear in mind that when we compare one mission to the next, the assumptions carry forward. We're not going to compare one mission to the next where this assumption is alleviated. It's going to be true regardless of the simulations at the time. So we might consider a 6-month mission and assume we have ISS medical resources available. And suppose we want to consider or compare 2 alternative missions, one with 3 crew members and one with 6 crew members. That's the only difference between these 2 missions. We just want to see whether our medical resources that we've supplied for 3 crew members, is that sufficient when we double the number of crew members. We're not implementing any primary prevention measures. We're not taking additional resources. The only thing we're doing is increasing the number of crew members. We assume two EVAs per crew member, and again, identical medical resources regardless of the number of crew members. First outcome we might consider is how many medical events are likely to occur. So here we have 3 crew members on a 6-month mission. We get a distribution of possible outcomes. On average, it looks like we're getting about 45 medical events. So we have 83 possible medical conditions in the model, and it looks like over the 6-month period, these 3 crew members in total are experiencing about 45 medical conditions. Now when we double the number of crew members to 6, you can probably expect to see a double in the total number of disorders, because the only thing that we've done is increase the number of crew members. And we do see that. We see on average we get about 90 total medical conditions. So this isn't particularly useful, but it's just a good example of the kind of output that we get from IMM. And the next question is, okay, well, we have 45 conditions or 90 conditions occurring, but what are they? And at this point we can do the sensitivity analyses. Take a step back. So just to compare the summary statistics, again you can see about 45 compared to 90 medical conditions. We do see a greater variation in the number of medical events between these 2 scenarios. So the next question is, what medical events are occurring? So we would like to know the number of medical events, what medical events are the most highly correlated with this outcome of interest. So our outcome is the total number of medical events. We'd like to know which ones are occurring. This is where we can perform these sensitivity analyses. And I know you can't read this, I just wanted to present this to show you what the output from Crystal Ball looks like. And what it is an ordered ranking of the variables that are in the model based on how correlated they are with the outcome of interest. If we look at the specific variables, we see that between the 3 crew members and 6 crew members, we're getting the same medical conditions that are occurring. I've just listed the top 4 here, just for example purposes, but regardless of the number, we see late insomnia, skin rash, skin abrasions, corneal abrasions. These are the medical events that seem to be occurring most frequently.
Has the model done anything to improve what you already knew going into the model? I mean, this is the information that you put into the model.
Yes.
Has the model done anything
Exactly. Not
to
yet.
add to that? Okay.
Not yet.
But it-
This is just,
Sit tight now. Yeah.
you're right, you could do this based on incidence rates and proportions. You can identify which ones are going to be occurring most frequently.
Okay.
Yes, you're right. So at this point, we ask, okay, we know what medical events are occurring. How is this affecting the crew health? And this is where we can look at our crew health index. And we said before, our goal really is to move over to this 100% side. And you can see from this distribution of outcomes of our crew health index, this is for 3 crew members, We have a very skewed distribution. It's heavily weighted toward the right-hand side, towards 100%. And we can take this, we can look at this in a little bit more detail on its own, but it's most beneficial if we compare it to other simulated missions. So what we're doing at this point is we're comparing the 3 crew members to 6 crew members. So we want to compare this to the results from a 6 crew member. Well, we can see an obvious shift in the distribution. When we have 3 crew members, we're heavily weighted on the right-hand side, probably 90, mean maybe around 95% or so. And when we move to 6 crew members, we see a shift to the left-hand side. Our mean moves down. If we compare the summary statistics, 3 crew members, we had an 85% mean. When we moved up to 6 crew members, it dropped down to 65% crew health index. We do see, again, we see a greater variation in the crew health index, in the distribution of the crew health index as well. So the question now is, well, what? It's not advancing. Thank you. So the question now is, why are we seeing the shift in the CHI? Why was the CHI decreased when we moved it up to 6 crew members? We can run the sensitivity analyses on the crew health index distributions, and I've just listed the top 2 conditions here for each scenario, and skin rash seems to be an important medical condition. Why? And there's all 83 medical conditions are going to come up in some order. They're all going to have some correlation with the outcome of interest. For purposes of this example, we're just going to look at skin rash in a little bit more detail and find out why it's coming out as the number 1 condition. Why is it describing the greatest variation in the outcome of interest? Next slide, please. Look at the, we can take a look at the medical resources for skin rash. We have 5 medical resources here, and what this graph is trying to show is, on the x-axis is the number of units of each resource that are remaining at the end of the mission. If we have a positive value, then we had sufficient resources. In fact, we had resources remaining at the end of the mission. So if we look at the yellow is prednisone, you can see that it's overwhelmingly weighted near the 100 mark. I think there's 100 units of prednisone in the model that are available. And we did run out, that is, we had a negative value. We ran out occasionally, but overwhelmingly we had plenty of prednisone. In fact, we may have had too much. The argument is that perhaps we don't need as much prednisone, and maybe we can take other resources. On the other hand, we look at some of the other resources, in particular the Lotrimin and the Benadryl, and you can see that we did in fact run out of Benadryl. We had negative units available, so we ran out. We had insufficient quantities of that resource by the end of the mission. This is for the 3 crew members. We'd like to compare this with 6 crew members. Next slide. See a very similar distribution, but everything's shifted to the left a little bit more. We had 6 crew members. There were more skin rashes. We used more resources. Again, with the prednisone, we see the same issue. We had plenty of prednisone. There was plenty left over. We probably carried too much. The Lotrimin and the Benadryl and even the triamcinolone, we seem to be running out. So what I'd like to do is just take a look at the Lotrimin in a little bit more detail, and we'll just pull that up. Next slide, please. On the top, left-hand side, we see the distribution of Lotrimin. This is the number of units remaining at the end of the mission. The positive values indicate that we had sufficient quantities for the trials for the simulated trials we ran. The negative quantities, we had an insufficient number of units of Lotrimin. From the graph there, we can see that we had insufficient quantities about 13% of the time. When we come down here and we compare that to 6 crew members, we had insufficient lotrimin about 76% of the time. So there's a marked increase in the percent of the trials for which we had insufficient lotrimin. Now, when we have insufficient lotrimin, our condition, skin rash, is going to go untreated in our model. Because we've run out of this resource, we may have had plenty of the other resources, but this was what we're calling an essential resource. And so it's going to go down our untreated path and result in a poorer outcome. Okay, next slide.
Is there sort of in the model, does it contain a feedback mechanism such that, say, you have an insufficient quantity of a particular medication or particular treatment, that now the consequence of that untreated goes higher, thus your demand goes higher, and so now you start to give greater demand for that particular pharmaceutical that you don't have?
No, it's not going to build like that. The untreated outcomes, in general, an untreated outcome is going to have a poorer outcome than a treated condition.
Understand.
So when we run out of a resource, we're going to decrement all of our resources just so we can keep track. And we realize that, for a simple example, if you have a headache and our research says that you need to take 2 ibuprofen, but you only have 1 left, we realize you're going to take that ibuprofen, and it's going to have some effect. But for the purposes of our model, we're going to decrement that ibuprofen, and the condition is going to go down an untreated path. So it's going to have a worse outcome. And this is, it's a little more conservative along those lines. But again, we have to draw the line somewhere. We can't consider every possibility. But it doesn't build.
And is there a communicability factor too, say between 3 crew and 6 crew, that if one crew develops a particular condition, that could be communicated to another crew member, such that it's not just doubling the number of crew doubles your incidence rate, but doubling the number of crew may amplify the incidence rate?
Right now, no. All of our medical events and crew members are completely independent entities. There's no correlations between them. But you're right. If there's a communicable disease or, as you gave an example, as you argued, there may be instances where if one person gets it, the rest of the crew may be more likely to experience that medical event. We don't have that in the model right now, but it's something that we have considered, and it's something that we may look into in the future. Put in correlations, basically. So, in summary, with respect to our example here, was the medical kit sufficient for 6 crew members? We had planned on only having 3 crew members. We didn't do anything with the medical kit, but we doubled the number of crew members. Well, we noticed a pretty substantial decrease in the CHI, and you could probably argue that it was not a sufficient medical kit. We were running out of certain medical resources. We presented one example. We can get into more detail on all of the other resources and try to find what we would like to do is find an optimum number of units of each resource to include on a mission. What conditions were having the greatest impact? In this example, we had skin rash. Others were paresthesia and corneal abrasions. Those were really impacting our crew health index. And why was skin rash impacting our CHI? Well, we know we were running out of lotrimin in particular. We were running out of others as well, but lotrimin was the one that we were running out most frequently. Next slide. So we can also explore other, just to give you a taste of other questions that we could ask, we can look at ibuprofen, see where it's going, do sensitivity analyses on it, find out what medical conditions are using it most frequently. We can increase the supply, the medical supply. How does that affect our CHI? Can we get our CHI for 6 crew members to look like that of the 3 crew members. We can compare missions of different durations. The one we did was a 6-month mission. Maybe we just want to compare a 24 versus a 33-day mission. We can consider different numbers of crew members. So the examples that we are looking at may be kind of obvious. We know there's going to be more medical conditions with a double in the number of crew members. But there are some questions that are more controversial. There are going to be different opinions, and IMM is intended to be a tool that can provide an objective viewpoint that can be used as a tool by researchers during the planning or other stages. Next slide. We can look at other outcomes, probability of evacuation, loss of crew life. We could develop a summary measure that combines all of these measures somehow, some kind of weighted average or something along those lines. That could be developed with a researcher that came in with a specific question. We could work with them to develop a specific outcome. Next slide. So just for example, the probability of evac. Here, we're looking at the number of events, number of medical events among the trials that could have resulted in an evacuation. Now, I'm not even presenting the crew or mission profiles. Here we have about 5% chance of evac. We want to know why. Was something wrong in our model? Did we have bad resource information? Was our incidence rate too high, too low? Which medical condition is driving this evac? So this is not, we can't, it's most useful in comparing different scenarios. Whenever we get an outcome like this, we want to know why. We don't want to just leave it at 5% evacuation. A lot of people aren't going to be happy with that. Some people might be happy with that. But we want to know why, and we have to investigate the assumptions and limitations. And if we're in agreement about the assumption, all of the assumptions and limitations that went into it, then we can take this value for what it's worth. Next slide. So it's a tool. IMM is a tool that can be used in the decision-making process, but it doesn't make decisions for you, and it provides an objective analysis of the data. And it's really most useful in comparing different mission or crew profiles, different scenarios.
Next slide. Thanks, Charlie. I know we're running short on time, so I'll make this quick. I've just got 2 slides. I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the next steps that were in place. So we're in the process of transitioning to the more capable software platform, SaaS. And at the same time, we're also developing some optimization techniques. So it'll be real interesting in about 6 months what we're able to do to optimize that mass and volume in flight. Because we're going to a more capable software platform, we're also developing a back-end database that holds all the resource table information and the cliff information, the incidence rates, the potential outcomes, the crew and equipment, or crew and the mission, and we're designing user interfaces for that. And then we're at the same time in parallel we're verifying and validating a lot of those inputs. So we've got a multi-thrust effort going on right now. In the next 12 months, some of the key milestones. In the spring, we'll be releasing IMM 2.0, and we're going to be initiating some external verification and validation processes. And at the end of next fiscal year, we're going to be transitioning into an operations mode, and so we're going to be tweaking bugs over the following fiscal year. So we're going to be prepping for that as well. When you look at the schedule on how IMM supports the programs, we're in good shape to support the Altar program, and Orion. We've got a lot of the inputs right now for the first version of the model, and even the output of the first version of the model can help support some of the trades and all that. So that, and then in fiscal year 11, that's when we're making our transition to operations, and then we'll be able to support SRR for ALTAR and the following programs. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what IMM is and where we're going and what its limitations and capabilities are. There's a lot of stuff that we did not cover, but I think we touched a little bit of every aspect of the project and the tool.
I just want to thank Doug's group for coming and speaking today, and we'll open this up for questions and answers if anybody has any questions that weren't covered already. But mostly, again, just a thanks to their group and to talk a little bit again about how this really is an integrated medical model, and but it is spanning just more than space medicine. I mean, it is looking across. It's looking at what hardware would you need to have? How does that affect the vehicle? How does that affect vehicle resources? How does it affect your mission planning? What does it do to training? What are the trade-offs that you have to have, and how can you try to quantify what you think is really going to happen? Because ultimately, I mean, that's what mission and vehicle planners want to know is what's the probabilistic risk? What's the risk? How can I do trade-offs so that they can make those hard choices? And also so that when they come back to the HSI community, the HSI community can make those hard choices as well as inputs to the program. So thanks again to Doug and the team. And with that, I'd like to, we'll probably be going off the air here. We probably already are, but I'd like to go ahead and open it up to discussion in case anybody has any questions here in the room. Thanks. Do you have any questions?
I have an observation, not a question. You have talked about SAS and how it only occurs once. I guess the question in my mind, maybe somebody already has a speculation, when you're going to the moon and you're going to stay there in a gravity field for 6 months and then you're coming back, do you have a window of opportunity for SAS upon landing and another one upon liftoff again, exposure to 0G? I understand that when you land on Earth in 1G, there's SAS type symptoms that occur, just reorienting to 1G. I don't know if it's going to hit you at 1/6G, and I don't know if the new transition from 1/6 back to 0. So those might be things that you need to consider as to whether or not they get folded in more than one time into a model.
Sure. I think in looking at missions like that, we would break it up into those different mission flags, and we'd have to make the appropriate adjustments. But, if you want.
Well, I had some thought. I've thought about that already. For the return, we probably have a separate condition, entry motion sickness. There is some data out there on that. We'll do that as a separate condition. It will also be an adaptation type condition, so you only get it once. For the lunar scenario, that's something we probably have to put in the model as another event, sort of a similar way we'll do that. The problem is we'd be speculating what the likelihood is, but we probably could figure out some type of guess or best guess based on maybe some previous Apollo missions we can go back and look at, and maybe look at the re-entry to Earth and make some guesses based on that. But and there's also non-space adaptation versions of some of those conditions. So you can get a space adaptation headache, but we also know you can get a headache. For example, we have CO2 headache in the model. I'm sorry we didn't get to show you the full list of conditions. Would answer all questions, but we account for similar conditions that are not space adaptation for most of those conditions. We have back injury, for example, separate from back pain. We try to account for that.
Any other questions?
So besides the Russian anecdotal data about the kidney stones, is there any other Russian data that you guys have taken into account from your experience? I noticed that wasn't on there, but is it just not measurable, or was it just something not considered?
Well, I think that question came up several times. At our first technical review, that question came up by a number of people, including Dr. John Park, but we purposely excluded the Russian data because we just didn't have enough reliability on what we had available. If we can get that data and we have enough certainty that it's occurred, so if we know that kidney stones occurred, we can use it. So that's a good example. So for kidney stone, we've gone the other route. I explained a little bit about, we've used the Bayesian update based on terrestrial data with the astronaut population as an alternative But if we can get the data and have good confidence, it's having confidence in their data. Our data's not perfect either, so
Right.
we need to consider that.
Interesting. Thank you.
Anything else?
Let me ask one. I guess, one, it sounds like you've done a lot of wonderful work here, a lot of work coming ahead. I'd like to see how we can integrate this with our lock law models that we have, that we're building for the program, because we're trying to analyze and assess human reliability.
By lock on, you mean loss of crew?
Loss of crew, loss of mission.
For constellation program.
Correct. Yeah. And I guess that leads to why we call it loss of crew life versus just loss of crew, because that's our definition too.
Sure.
So just trying to make sure our terminology comes together. But from a human reliability viewpoint, as you were talking about physiological changes and so forth coming back into gravity and things like that, we're trying to figure out how to better assess that from a human reliability viewpoint that we haven't had that kind of data. It sounds like maybe you do have some data along that lines, and that would be good for us to get together. Fatigue is another issue the crew office has, trying to understand how longer missions affect crews, and so therefore the reliability of the crew to perform their mission functions.
Fatigue is an interesting problem because it can be carried through prolonged durations of the mission. We don't really carry it as a specific.
It's been difficult to characterize some medical, I guess, conditions like fatigue or muscle weakness as true conditions, because it's hard to characterize them as medical conditions and getting incidents, but there are important factors to somehow try to capture in the model if we can. But in reference to your question about loss of mission and loss of crew, just a quick background. The reason we had LOC as loss of crew. There was a acronym within space medicine of levels of care, LOC, and there was some confusion developing within that. So we went to loss of crew.
And loss of communication.
Yeah.
There was a whole bunch of LOCs that we were getting, some people had a little confusion with, so that was the reason. But our loss of crew life is the same as the other constellation programs. Lock or loss of crew. There's no difference. The problem we did have was with loss of mission. That's putting us in output. We had difficulty conceptualizing how to predict loss of mission when we don't know what the mission is yet. So, for example, in Apollo, we believe that the mission was defined as safely landing a man and woman, getting him back. That's probably not our mission anymore. So how do we define? We need to know what the mission is first before this type of model can tell you if you've lost your mission. But I think if you look at crew health index, that'll give you a hint of loss of mission. So if you have a scenario where you get an 80 to 90% crew health index versus a 50%, you know that you've increased your chance of successful mission by having a higher crew health index. Maybe we can do better than that down the road, but it may mean incorporating a timeline and some other things, and knowing what the mission is for the program.
We share the same issue
Okay.
with mission. Right now, I think loss of mission is defined for lunar sortie as we land, we plant a flag, and raise our hands in success, but not knowing any more than duration of stay time.
Getting back.
And I would agree with you in saying that this is the human research program has really endeavored in the past several years to start doing more directed research or technology development, and has really been looking to the Constellation program for potential stakeholders to say, how can what we're developing really help you? And so the various elements or aspects of the human research program, of which the advanced medical capability is one of them, and that's what this is being developed under that guise. They really are. And the problem is that they're so focused, heads down, doing this kind of great work, that unless they have somebody who can, like this kind of a presentation or some sort of exposure, it's hard for them in some cases to go out and find those true stakeholders or get their foot in the door to show, hey, this is a tool or a product that maybe you can use. So there's been a lot of success in some areas, minimal success in others, but that's part of what all of these knowledge broadcasts are about, is to try to not only let people within our own discipline on, but also people outside of our disciplinary, so that maybe we can help to start building those bridges. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, because the interfaces you were talking about with power and air and water and so forth, communications, bandwidth, not necessarily bandwidth specifically, but that's the kind of things that we have, if you will, in the hardware PRA, along with external events and so forth. So I see a good opportunity ahead for trying to pull this together.
Another way to look at it is this is a baseline or generic version of the model. And then once we know more about the mission, we can adjust the model to be less generic.
Yeah.
And put those specifics in.
Our problem too. Good.
Anything else? Then I guess that concludes our session for today. I'd like to